The newly minted Harmony Heights residential complex, a gleaming testament to interspecies cohabitation, was anything but harmonious at the moment. Or maybe it was, just not in the way the architects envisioned. Mark Olson, a man whose usual habitat consisted of dimly lit workshops and the occasional drone race circuit, felt like a bewildered goldfish dropped into a technicolor koi pond. He clutched a lukewarm cup of what the automated kiosk called universal nutrient beverage, and scanned the room with a mixture of skepticism and morbid curiosity. The grand hall was a swirling vortex of strange forms and unfamiliar scents. There were the bulbous, floating Glargonians who seemed to communicate by clicking their mandibles, and the sleek, feline-like Kryll, who moved with a disconcerting grace. Several smaller, rodent-like beings from the planet Xylo were scurrying around, chattering in high-pitched tones that made Mark's teeth ache. And then there was her. Zyl. Even her name sounded like a melody from another dimension. She stood near the far wall, her form a stark contrast to the earth-toned surroundings. Her skin, a mesmerizing swirl of teal and emerald, pulsed gently with an internal light. Large, multifaceted eyes, like polished obsidian, scanned the room with an unnerving intensity. And then there were the tentacles, 4 of them, thick and supple, extending from her back like living, inquisitive vines. They writhed and twitched, each movement captivating and, if he was honest with himself, a little unnerving. She was, in a word, breathtaking. And also, very, very alien. Quite a sight, isn't she? A voice startled Mark, causing him to nearly spill his nutrient beverage down his shirt. He turned to see a wiry, pale man with a perpetually surprised expression. This was Gerald, the complex's designated interspecies liaison. Or, as Mark liked to think of him, the resident translator of weird. Sight is one word for it, Gerald, Mark muttered, taking a sip of his lukewarm drink. I'm pretty sure she's about to either ask for my soul or try to mate with the table. He gestured towards a nearby table where several Xylos were gathered, all of them emitting a low hum that vibrated through the floor. Gerald chuckled nervously. Oh, you'll get used to them. Zyl is actually quite reserved. For a Xylos, anyway. They're very emotional, their skin kind of shows it. She's quite the artist. And she's on the verge of her mating cycle, so, a lot of heightened emotions all the time. He adjusted his glasses, peering at Mark with an almost pleading expression. Try not to stare too much. It's considered rude. Right, got it. Don't stare at the alien with the living tentacles. Noted, Mark replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He shifted his gaze back to Zyl, who seemed to be having some sort of animated conversation with another Xylos, her skin now flashing with a range of colors that resembled a psychedelic light show. One of her tentacles gestured emphatically, making him wonder if she was arguing about the merits of different types of space algae or the proper way to fold a nebula. He took a breath and decided to be less of a jerk and at least try to be polite. After all, he was going to be living here for a while. Taking a step forward, Mark straightened his already rumpled shirt, which was more grease-stained than appropriate for interspecies diplomacy. He approached with what he hoped was an approachable smile. Hey. I'm Mark. I'm also living here, I guess? He offered a hesitant wave, feeling utterly ridiculous as he did so. Zyl turned her gaze upon him, her multifaceted eyes fixing on his face with a laser-like intensity. Her skin shifted to a soft, glowing lavender, and she made a series of melodic clicks that vibrated not just in the air, but also, disconcertingly, somewhere deep inside Mark's chest. Greetings, Mark, she replied, her voice like liquid silver, yet possessing an undertone that sent shivers down his spine. I am Zyl. She inclined her head in a gesture that was both elegant and strangely unsettling. Mark swallowed, suddenly feeling less skeptical and more captivated. Nice to meet you, Zyl. So, you're new here too, right? He kicked himself mentally for the banality of his opening gambit, wondering how he was going to navigate a conversation with someone whose very biology was a mystery to him. I have been here for approximately 4 cycles, she replied, her tentacles making gentle, undulating motions as she spoke. Mark found himself focusing on them, intrigued by the way they seemed to move independently of her. Cycles, he echoed, raising an eyebrow. Like Earth days? ZYL-Thara's skin flickered with a soft, sapphire blue that seemed to indicate amusement. No, human units. A Xylo cycle equates to approximately 12 Earth days. I have been on this world for 48 days. Give or take some planetary rotations. Right, of course. Cycles. Makes total sense, Mark said, feeling very out of his depth. He then had a brilliant idea, thinking of his one area of expertise, robotics. He wanted to at least have a conversation topic. So, what do you think of Earth? He asked. The technology must be a bit primitive compared to where you're from. A soft, emerald light rippled across ZYL-Thara's skin, and she made a series of clicks that sounded both amused and curious. Primitive, she repeated, tilting her head. Your drones are rather straightforward. Efficient, but lacking in artistic potential. Your method of aerial movement is somewhat crude. Mark bristled slightly at the criticism, but then laughed. Crude? I'll have you know my crude drones have won quite a few races. He gestured towards a nearby table where his own racing drone was sitting, disassembled for repairs. ZYL-Thara tilted her head, her multifaceted eyes focusing on the disassembled drone parts. The aesthetics are utilitarian, she stated, her tone matter-of-fact. She moved closer, her tentacles twitching with curiosity, and that's when it happened. One of her tentacles reached out, drawn to the magnetic coil of Mark's drone. Before Mark could shout a warning, the tentacle had wrapped itself around the coil, causing a loud crackle of energy and a shower of sparks. The hall erupted in a cacophony of clicks, chirps, and startled gasps. Mark stared, his jaw dropping. ZYL-Thara's skin shifted to a vibrant shade of crimson, her eyes wide with surprise. The drone began to whir erratically, its motor screeching, before suddenly exploding with a series of colorful pops and bangs. Pieces of metal, plastic and wiring were scattered across the hall. Mark blinked, his face covered with soot, a stray wire dangling from his hair. He looked at the smoking remains of his prized drone, then back at ZYL-Thara, who was now trying to hide behind her other tentacles. Well, Mark said, his voice flat. That escalated quickly. ZYL-Thara made a high-pitched trilling sound, her skin pulsing with a shade of deep purple that Mark assumed was a mixture of embarrassment and panic. One of her tentacles began to gently pat the soot on Mark's face, an action that felt both soothing and strangely sensual. My sincere apologies, Mark, she said, her voice tinged with concern. I did not intend to dismantle your device. Mark sighed, pushing a lock of hair off his forehead. No problem, ZYL-Thara. Just another normal day at Harmony Heights, I guess. He offered her a wry smile, a flicker of humor dancing in his eyes. This was going to be interesting. He looked at the mess of parts, then at the alien with the living tentacles, a strange mixture of dread and excitement beginning to bubble in his chest. One thing was for sure, living with an alien roommate was going to be anything but boring. And perhaps, just perhaps, it might even be a little bit romantic. Even if it was a romantic disaster waiting to happen. The aftermath of the tentacle incident, as Mark had begun to call it, was surprisingly mild. The communal hall was cleaned up by a team of robotic custodians, and Gerald, the perpetually flustered interspecies liaison, had promised to expedite the replacement drone part order for Mark. ZYL-Thara, for her part, had retreated to her living quarters, leaving Mark with a lingering sense of bewildered curiosity. Mark's own apartment was a minimalist affair, designed for humans and featuring the kind of sterile functionality that was supposed to promote productivity but mostly just made him feel like he was living in a particularly bland spreadsheet. He spent most of his evening tinkering with the surviving bits of his drone, occasionally glancing towards the closed door that separated his living space from ZYL-Thara's. He was still trying to process the kaleidoscope of emotions he'd felt during their encounter, from annoyance at the destruction of his drone to a strange, almost magnetic pull towards her unique form and ethereal presence. The next morning, Mark decided he needed a change of scenery. and a better understanding of Xylo's culture if he was going to live in such close proximity to it. He headed to the communal kitchen, hoping that the universal breakfast nutrient paste would be marginally more palatable than the liquid they served at the social events. As he approached the dispenser, he noticed Zyl-Thara already there, her back to him. Her skin was a soft, pearlescent white, and her tentacles were moving with a slow, graceful rhythm. "Good morning," Mark said, trying to sound casual as he approached. Zyl-Thara turned, her skin shifting to a gentle shade of sky blue. "Mark," she said, her voice as melodic as ever. "I trust your human sleep cycle was satisfactory?" Mark chuckled. "Yeah, pretty much. You know, sleep. Hours of blissful nothingness. You guys do that on Xylo?" Her skin rippled with a shade of violet. "We enter a state of low-energy regeneration, yes. It is not quite the same as your human unconsciousness." "Who? So, less blissful nothingness, more efficient processing?" Mark mused, selecting the mixed fruit option from the nutrient paste dispenser, which looked suspiciously like something you'd find in a tube of kids' art supplies. Zyl-Thara's tentacles twitched slightly, and her skin flashed a hint of gold. "One could describe it that way. Your method seems rather wasteful." "Wasteful?" Mark scoffed, taking a cautious sip of his fruit paste, which tasted vaguely of artificial raspberries and existential dread.